The wind swept across the plains, carrying with it whispers of destiny, the kind that changes the course of a man's life forever. In a land where silence often spoke louder than words, a cowboy known for his quiet strength was suddenly given an order that rattled his soul. He was to wed a young orphan girl. No one asked for his heart. No one cared for her dreams. It was simply a decision carved into the dust of the West, where survival often outweighed desire. But what neither the town nor the cowboy expected were the words that would escape the girl's lips, words sharp enough to cut deeper than any blade. From the moment she spoke, the air around them shifted. Her voice was steady, but each syllable carried the weight of pain, resilience, and a truth too raw to ignore. The cowboy, a man who had faced storms, gunmen, and endless solitude, suddenly found himself shaken by the force of something he had never known: her courage. The townsfolk leaned closer, as if her defiance echoed in their own hidden wounds, daring to awaken memories they had buried long ago. This was no ordinary union, and it was no ordinary girl. She was young, yes, but her spirit had been carved by fire, by nights of hunger, by days of abandonment, by the cruel laughter of those who dismissed her worth. She was not stepping into marriage as a victim of fate, but as a fighter who refused to let silence define her. Her words carried the power to unmask the hypocrisy of a town that believed it could dictate her future without ever asking for her voice. The cowboy, who had lived by unspoken codes, who found solace in silence, now felt an unfamiliar stir in his chest. For the first time, he questioned whether obedience to the old rules of the West was true strength, or if real strength lay in listening to the fragile, fiery truth of a girl who had nothing, yet dared to stand against everything. In her defiance, he saw a reflection of his own unspoken battles, the kind he had buried beneath years of restraint. And so, with one sentence, the story of a quiet man and an orphan girl became more than a forced union. It became a clash of wills, a collision of past scars and unyielding courage, a tale that would ripple through the dusty streets and into the hearts of all who witnessed it. Because in that moment, the West itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether silence would prevail or whether truth, spoken by the least expected voice, would change everything. The morning sun broke across the horizon, painting the prairie in hues of gold and crimson, yet the air carried a heaviness no dawn could lift. The townsfolk gathered near the chapel, their boots sinking into dust as anticipation settled like a storm cloud. Whispers rose in the crowd, some filled with curiosity, others with judgment. They came not to celebrate love, but to witness an arrangement forged by authority, a binding of two souls neither had chosen. The quiet cowboy stood tall, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow, but his heart was restless, caught between obedience to tradition and the faint stirrings of rebellion within. The orphan girl, wrapped in a modest dress worn thin by time, did not tremble as many expected. Her eyes, steady and unyielding, carried the fire of someone who had seen too much for her years. The silence between her and the cowboy was louder than the murmur of the crowd, as though the earth itself waited for what she would say next. She had spoken words before that unsettled him, but now, with every gaze fixed upon her, the weight of her truth grew heavier still. The preacher, worn and weary, opened his book with a solemn voice that echoed against the wooden walls of the chapel. He began to recite the vows, each phrase hanging in the air like a chain meant to bind. Yet as he spoke, the girl's hands tightened, her knuckles white, her breath sharp. It was not fear, it was defiance, raw and untamed, ready to break through the moment the preacher paused. The cowboy, sensing it, felt his chest tighten, as though her silence before the storm shook him more than a band of armed men ever could. When the preacher's voice faltered for breath, the girl stepped forward. Her words were not loud, yet they struck with the force of thunder. She declared that no man, no preacher, and no town had the right to dictate the destiny of a soul. Her voice quivered only for a moment, then grew stronger, fueled by every hardship she had endured. She spoke of loss, of loneliness, and of a hunger deeper than bread, a hunger for freedom, for dignity, for the chance to choose. The crowd stiffened, murmurs rising like uneasy winds through the prairie. The cowboy's eyes met hers, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir that he could not control. It was not pity. It was not anger. It was respect. Her defiance awakened in him the memory of every injustice he had silently endured, every command he had followed without question. The words she spoke were dangerous, yes, but they were also liberating. And in that moment, the quiet man, long bound by duty and silence, found himself questioning not just the marriage, but the very foundations of the life he had been forced to live. The silence that followed her declaration was deafening. Dust shifted beneath boots as men exchanged uneasy glances, and women pressed their hands against their chests as if to steady their hearts. Never had an orphan girl dared to speak such words in public, not in a town ruled by order and tradition. The preacher's face paled, his lips trembling, as though the very weight of her defiance threatened to shatter the authority of his book. Yet the girl did not falter. Her gaze remained fixed on the cowboy, daring him to either step into her truth or retreat into silence. The sheriff, standing near the back, shifted uncomfortably. He had been the one to enforce the town's decree, to ensure the cowboy complied with the order. His hand rested near his holster, not out of threat, but from instinct, for he knew the West could turn violent in the blink of an eye when order was challenged. But the girl's words carried no violence, only a piercing honesty that cut through the false peace of the town. The cowboy's silence now became more dangerous than any weapon, for the choice lay with him, and everyone knew it. Memories surged through his mind, memories of long rides across empty plains, of orders barked by men in power, of a life lived in quiet obedience. He had never been asked what he wanted, never been given the chance to choose. And now, before him stood a girl who embodied everything he had buried deep within himself. She was fragile, yes, but her spirit was stronger than the steel of his revolver. Her defiance was not just her own. It was his, unspoken, waiting to rise. The crowd began to split in murmurs. Some whispered that the girl was ungrateful, a fool to reject the stability of marriage to a man who could protect her. Others, especially the weary and broken, saw in her words a truth they had long been too afraid to speak. The town was divided, and yet all eyes returned to the cowboy. He, the man of silence, now held the power to either silence the girl or amplify her voice by standing with her. The cowboy's jaw tightened. His hand, resting on the brim of his hat, lowered slowly as he took a step forward. Every creak of the wooden floor beneath him seemed to echo like a gunshot in the stillness. His eyes locked with hers, not as a man forced to take a wife, but as a soul confronting another soul. In that moment, the quiet cowboy understood. This was no longer about marriage, nor about obedience. It was about truth, about freedom, about a choice that could change not just his fate, but the destiny of the entire town. The preacher's hand trembled as he closed the book, the sound of its cover snapping shut echoing like the crack of a whip. For a brief instant, it seemed as though the walls of the chapel themselves leaned closer, straining to hear what would unfold. The girl's words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, a challenge to every law and every unspoken rule that had shaped their lives. The cowboy remained still, his silence a storm building within, while the townsfolk shifted uneasily, caught between fear and fascination. The girl's breath came steadily, her chin raised high as though daring the world to strike her down. She had lived too long under the weight of others' decisions, and now, with the eyes of the entire town upon her, she would not retreat. "I am not a burden to be traded, nor a shadow to be commanded," she said, her voice trembling only from the rawness of her truth. Each word drove deeper into the hearts of the listeners, stirring old wounds, reigniting long-forgotten dreams of freedom. The cowboy felt the fire in her defiance strike something hidden in himself. Memories of his father's stern orders, of wars fought in silence, of years spent bowing his head to survive. Each memory rose like ghosts. He realized he had been molded into a man who obeyed, not a man who lived. And now, before him, stood someone who refused to bow, someone who risked everything for the right to be heard. In her courage, he saw the path he had never dared to walk. From the back of the chapel, an old woman wept silently, her tears cutting through lines of age carved by hardship. She whispered a prayer not for tradition, but for the girl's strength to endure. Others began to stir, questioning the justice of binding two lives through command alone. But still, the sheriff's hand lingered at his belt, and the preacher's eyes burned with the weight of authority. The balance of power was fragile, ready to break with a single choice. The cowboy stepped forward at last, his boots thudding against the wood, each sound striking through the silence like a drumbeat of change. His eyes lingered on the girl, steady and unwavering, then turned briefly to the crowd. He did not speak yet, but his presence, his movement, carried a message no words could match. The man known for silence was preparing to break it, and the town held its breath, knowing whatever he said would mark the beginning of something they could never undo. When his voice finally came, it was low and steady, like distant thunder rolling across the plains. "A man cannot be forced to honor vows he did not choose," he said, his words deliberate, his tone sharper than steel. The chapel gasped, the very foundation of authority shaken by his defiance. For years, the cowboy had been a figure of obedience, of quiet strength that never questioned. To hear him speak against the order was to witness the earth itself split open. The preacher slammed his hand against the pulpit, his face red with anger. "This is the law of the town," he shouted. "Defy it, and you defy God himself." But the cowboy did not flinch, nor did the girl. Instead, her eyes glistened with something more powerful than fear: hope. In his words, she heard the first echo of freedom, proof that her voice had not been in vain. The sheriff stepped forward now, his boots heavy against the floor. His voice carried authority, but also hesitation. "Careful, cowboy," he warned. "You know what happens to men who break the rules. You know what happens when order is challenged." His words were meant to intimidate, yet they trembled with the weight of uncertainty. For deep down, even the sheriff knew, perhaps for the first time, that order built on silence could not stand forever. The cowboy turned his gaze on the crowd. "You all came here to watch a union that wasn't born of love, but of command," he said, his voice growing stronger with every word. "But ask yourselves, how many of you have lived lives you did not choose? How many of you bowed your heads, not because it was right, but because it was expected?" His words rippled through the room like wildfire, igniting hidden embers in hearts long resigned to silence. The girl's hand trembled as she reached for his, not in weakness, but in defiance. Together, they stood at the center of the chapel, not as a bride and groom bound by decree, but as two souls refusing to be broken. Their unity was not forged by the preacher's book, nor by the sheriff's law, but by choice. And in that fragile yet powerful moment, the crowd understood. The West itself was changing, one voice at a time. The preacher's fury boiled over, his voice rising above the whispers that now filled the chapel. "This is rebellion," he thundered, his fist striking the pulpit as if to drive obedience back into the hearts of the townsfolk. Yet no matter how loud his cries, they could not drown out the truth that had already taken root. The girl's defiance and the cowboy's words had pierced deeper than scripture or law could ever reach. The people had seen courage, and once seen, courage could not be forgotten. Among the crowd, a ranch hand stepped forward, his hat clutched tightly in his calloused hands. "Preacher," he said, his voice quivering with equal parts fear and conviction. "What she spoke, it's the truth. We've all been bound by rules that serve the powerful more than they serve God." His words cracked open the silence further, and soon others began to murmur agreement, their voices timid but growing. The preacher's face grew pale, realizing his authority was slipping like sand through clenched fists. The sheriff shifted uneasily, his hand still near his holster, yet his eyes betrayed something softer, a memory, perhaps, of choices stolen from him long ago. He saw in the girl and the cowboy what he once wished he had dared to become. His jaw clenched as he weighed duty against conscience. It was a battle written in his eyes, one the whole town could see. Authority demanded obedience, but his heart begged for mercy. The cowboy, feeling the moment teetering on the edge of chaos, raised his voice again, stronger now, as if each word were hammered from iron. "We were not meant to live as shadows of other men's decisions. If freedom costs us everything, then it is still worth the price. His words cut like lightning through the storm of fear, and heads began to nod, hearts began to stir, as the people realized he was not only speaking for himself and the orphan girl, he was speaking for them all. The girl, emboldened by the shift in the crowd, stepped forward beside him. "I was called an orphan," she said, her voice steady, "but today I claim a new name, free." Her words shimmered in the air, delicate yet unbreakable, and in that moment, she became more than a girl without family. She became a symbol. The people who once pitted her now looked at her with awe, and the quiet cowboy knew the West would never forget what she had done. The preacher's hands shook as he clutched his book tighter, his authority slipping with every heartbeat. He raised the scripture high, his voice cracking as he cried out warnings of damnation, of the wrath that awaited those who defied the law. Yet the crowd no longer trembled. Where once his words carried weight, now they sounded hollow, like the fading echoes of a bell whose power had been broken. The sheriff finally stepped forward, the air heavy with expectation. All eyes turned to him, knowing he alone held the power to enforce the town's decree or to let this new fire burn. His hand lingered near his revolver, but when he spoke, his words were softer than anyone expected. "Maybe it's time we remember that law without justice is no law at all." The gasp that rippled through the crowd was not of fear, but of hope. The West, for the first time, felt the tremor of change. The girl's eyes shimmered as she turned to the cowboy. She had fought her whole life for scraps of dignity, for moments where her voice might matter. Now, standing before the entire town, her words had shaken the silence of men and broken the chains of expectation. Her lips trembled into the faintest smile, not of victory, but of relief. She was no longer alone. The cowboy reached for her hand, his grip firm, not as a claim of ownership, but as a vow of solidarity. He had spent his life following orders, his silence mistaken for weakness. Yet in this moment, his quiet nature revealed its true strength. He had listened, he had understood, and now he had chosen. Together, they faced the preacher, the sheriff, and the crowd, not as pawns of tradition, but as free souls carving their own destiny. And as the sun poured through the chapel windows, casting long beams of light across the wooden floor, it felt as though heaven itself bore witness to the moment. The West was not built on silence, nor on decrees, but on the courage of those who dare to speak, to stand, and to choose. And today, an orphan girl and a quiet cowboy had done just that. The chapel, once a place of unquestioned order, had become the stage of a revolution. The preacher, red-faced and trembling, shouted threats into the air, but his voice had lost its grip on the hearts before him. For the first time, the people were not looking to him for direction. They were looking to the cowboy and the orphan girl. Their unity, forged not by command but by choice, carried more weight than all the laws ever imposed on the town. A blacksmith, broad-shouldered and weary from years of silence, raised his voice. "I've bent my back for men who never once cared for mine," he declared, "and I called it duty. But maybe what I thought was duty was just fear." His words struck a chord, awakening memories in others. Memories of debts unfairly demanded, of choices taken, of dreams buried beneath obedience. One by one, heads began to lift, eyes began to brighten with something long forgotten, defiance. The sheriff's breath caught his chest as he realized the tide was turning. For years, he had been the hand that enforced the town's will, but now that will was cracking before him. He could still raise his weapon, still force compliance, but in doing so, he would only fan the flames of rebellion. He knew the truth. This was no longer about two souls bound by decree. It was about an entire people awakening to their right to choose. The cowboy felt the weight of every gaze on him, but he did not falter. His silence had always been his shield, but now his words were his weapon. "This girl is not just an orphan," he said, his voice steady as steel. "She is the proof that no man, no preacher, no law can chain the spirit of the free. And if standing with her makes me an outlaw, then so be it." The words rang out like a gunshot, final and undeniable, shaking even the oldest foundations of authority. The girl's eyes burned with gratitude as she stood taller than ever before. She was no longer defined by loss, no longer the child abandoned by fate. She was the spark that had set fire to a town's silence, and beside her stood a man who had turned his quiet strength into defiance. Together, they were no longer victims of the West. They were shaping it. The preacher stumbled backward, his authority crumbling faster than he could contain. His book, once held high as a symbol of control, slipped from his grasp and landed on the wooden floor with a hollow thud. The sound reverberated through the chapel, not as a warning, but as a symbol of a broken order. No one rushed to pick it up. No one dared to restore what had already been undone. The sheriff's hand left his holster at last. For the first time in years, he looked not like an enforcer of law, but like a man weary of chains himself. His voice, low but resolute, carried through the silence. Let them go. Let them choose. The murmurs swelled into gasps, then into cheers. The people who had gathered expecting a forced union now witnessed something far greater. The birth of a freedom none of them had dared to imagine. The girl's chest rose with a breath of relief, so deep it seemed to carry away years of sorrow. She had not only spoken for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. Tears welled in her eyes, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming truth that she had changed the course of her life with nothing but the strength of her voice. The West had always been harsh, but now, in this moment, it had also become hers. The cowboy, still holding her hand, felt something stir inside him that he had buried beneath years of obedience. For the first time, he was not living by another man's decree. He was living by his own choice. His quiet had been mistaken for submission, but now his silence had given birth to words that shook an entire town. He understood now that strength was not measured by the ability to endure commands, but by the courage to resist them. As the doors of the chapel opened, sunlight flooded the room, washing over the faces of those who had borne witness. The crowd spilled into the streets, their whispers transformed into a roar of possibility. The West, a land known for its unforgiving laws and unyielding traditions, had bent for the first time, not through violence, but through truth. And at its heart stood an orphan girl and a cowboy who had finally found his voice. The townsfolk followed the cowboy and the girl out into the street, their footsteps stirring dust that shimmered beneath the noonday sun. What had begun as a gathering to witness a forced marriage had transformed into something far greater, a reckoning. Men who had once bowed their heads in silence now straightened their backs. Women who had endured in quiet dignity now felt a new strength rising within them. The street itself seemed alive, vibrating with the weight of change. The preacher, still clutching his fallen authority, staggered to the chapel door but did not cross its threshold. His voice, once feared, was drowned by the rising murmur of freedom spreading through the crowd. He shouted warnings of judgment, of divine wrath, but his words no longer carried the same power. They fell into the dust, forgotten before they touched the ground. The people no longer looked to him for salvation. They looked to one another. The sheriff stepped into the sunlight, his badge catching the glow as if to remind him of his duty. Yet he did not reach for his weapon. Instead, he raised his hand to quiet the crowd. The law was meant to protect, he said slowly, but a law that steals freedom is no law at all. His voice carried farther than he expected, and for the first time, the crowd saw not an enforcer, but a man who stood with them. Authority had shifted, not through violence, but through truth. The girl, her voice clear and unwavering, spoke again. We're not bound by chains unless we accept them. Today I stand free, not because they allowed it, but because I chose it. Her words rippled through the people, striking chords in hearts long silenced. She was no longer seen as a fragile orphan, but as a figure of resilience, someone who had turned her pain into power. She had become the voice of a future the West had never dared to imagine. The cowboy looked at her with a quiet reverence, his silence no longer heavy, but full of meaning. In her defiance, he had found his own freedom. In her words, he had discovered his own voice. The crowd saw it too. The union that was once forced had been broken, but in its place stood something stronger, a partnership not of law, but of choice. And that choice carried more power than any decree ever could. As the dust settled, the people realized they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The West had always been a land of survival, ruled by harsh laws and harder men, but now something new had taken root. Courage, choice, freedom. It spread like wildfire, impossible to contain. Families whispered of their own hidden dreams, of the lives they might finally claim for themselves. The town, once defined by obedience, now pulsed with possibility. The preacher retreated into the shadows of the chapel, his authority shattered. His warnings of damnation no longer held the people hostage. He had built his power on silence, but silence had been broken. His words were relics now, remnants of a world that had begun to fade. The town had heard a different sermon, one written not in scripture, but in the courage of a girl who had refused to bow. The sheriff removed his badge and stared at it for a long moment. It had once been a symbol of order, of control, but now it felt heavy, tarnished by the weight of rules that had served power more than justice. Slowly, he pinned it back to his chest, not as a mark of authority, but as a promise to uphold what was right. The crowd saw the change in him, and for the first time, they trusted not his badge, but the man behind it. The cowboy, still silent beside the girl, did not need to speak further. His actions had already spoken louder than words. He had chosen her, not because the town demanded it, but because he saw in her the strength he had long buried in himself. Together, they were not symbols of rebellion, but of truth. Their union was not forced, yet it bound them tighter than any vow. For in standing against the town, they had stood for each other. And as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty street, the people knew this day would not be forgotten. The story of the quiet cowboy and the orphan girl would travel across the plains, carried by wind and word, a reminder that even in the harshest lands, freedom can be claimed by those brave enough to speak and strong enough to listen. The story of the quiet cowboy and the orphan girl is not just about defying a forced union. It is about breaking the silence that holds so many captive. Their courage revealed that true strength is not found in obedience to unjust rules, but in daring to stand for what is right, even when the world expects you to bow. Their voices became the spark that ignited a town's awakening, and their choice became the proof that freedom is never given, it is claimed. What began inside a small chapel transformed into something much greater than vows or tradition. It became a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, even when surrounded by voices that command silence, one act of courage can shift the course of many lives. The West, with all its dust and struggle, was reshaped in that single day, not by law, but by truth spoken at the right time. And that truth echoed louder than any sermon or decree. For the cowboy, it was the moment he discovered that silence can hide strength, but only words chosen with conviction can set it free. For the girl, it was the day she stopped being an orphan in the eyes of others and became a voice that carried across the plains. Together, they showed that even the most unlikely souls can shape history when they refuse to surrender their dignity. Their union was not forced by law, but by choice, and that choice became unshakable. This story lingers because it speaks to something within us all. How many times do we remain silent when we should speak? How often do we obey out of fear rather than conviction? The quiet cowboy and the orphan girl remind us that destiny is not written by the hands of others. It is carved by the courage to stand and declare, "I will not be bound." Their story is not just of the West. It is of every heart that longs for freedom. And now, I invite you to carry this reflection with you. If their courage moved you, let it remind you that your voice matters too. Share your thoughts in the comments, because your perspective can inspire others. Like this video if you believe freedom and dignity are worth standing for, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story that challenges the silence. Together, we can keep these voices alive, and in doing so, ensure that no truth is ever lost to the dust.